Okay, so today we're diving into the Vietnam War.
Okay.
But not the one you'd find in a history book.
Right.
We're kind of trading battle plans and body counts for something a lot more, intimate.
Yeah.
The lives of women who served.
Right.
You sent over excerpts from Kristin Hanna's novel, The Women.
Yes.
And I have a feeling this is going to get emotional.
It is. What's remarkable about this novel is how it captures that contrast.
Yeah.
Between the kind of like official narrative of the war.
Right.
And then the raw, like lived experiences
of
those on the front lines.
Right. And we're seeing it through the eyes of Frankie McGrath, this young woman
right.
who leaves her comfortable life in California to volunteer.
Yeah.
She packs a dress for parties, for goodness sake.
Right.
Talk about a rude awakening.
It's that disconnect between expectation and reality is so central, I think, to the early part of the novel.
Yeah.
Frankie arrives almost expecting this kind of structured,
right.
almost noble experience, shaped by Cold War propaganda.
Of course, yeah.
But Hannah doesn't let us or Frankie off easy.
No, she doesn't. And the sensory details that she uses, the stifling heat, the chaotic jumble of the base.
Right.
Even just the way that Frankie describes the air smelling different. It's like you're right there with her feeling that naivete just crumble.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Remember that scene where Frankie unpacks a framed photo of her and her brother at Disneyland?
Oh, yeah.
Trying to create this tiny haven of home?
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking when you contrast that with the primitive living conditions, the constant threat of disease, the ever-present sounds of helicopters that she describes.
It makes you realize that for Frankie and likely countless other young women who served, the Vietnam War wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was this internal battle, too, of holding on to your humanity in a place that felt determined to strip it away.
Hannah brilliantly uses that juxtaposition to kind of foreshadow the emotional toll that the war will take on Frankie. And we see it even in those early interactions with other nurses like Barb and Ethel.
Yeah, those relationships already becoming her lifeline, right?
Absolutely.
Barb's got that tough-as-nails exterior, no-nonsense attitude.
Exactly. She's seen it all and becomes a guide for Frankie.
Right.
Someone who helps her navigate the practical and emotional minefield of the war.
And then there's Ethel, who offers a completely different kind of support.
Right.
She's that listening ear, the shoulder to cry on.
Yeah.
But even with those friendships forming, there's this looming sense of dread.
Yes.
You just know Frankie's in for a world of hate.
And that's where the novel really starts to unpack the complexities of wartime experience. It's not just about the physical danger, but also the moral dilemmas, the emotional fallout.
And speaking of emotional fallout, we can't forget about Jamie the doctor.
Right.
Frankie develops feelings for talk about a complicated situation, this intense connection in the middle of a war zone, but he's married.
It's a testament to Hannah's writing that she doesn't shy away from these morally ambiguous situations. It would be easy to make this a straightforward love story, but the fact that Jamie is married adds this layer of guilt. Of impossible choices that I think a lot of people in wartime situations must have grappled with.
There's a scene that really stuck with me where Frankie and Jamie get caught in that torrential downpour.
Yeah.
They both confess their feelings but choose to honor his marriage instead of acting on them. It's such a powerful moment of both passion and restraint. You can really feel the weight of their circumstances bearing down on them. What do you think is the significance of Hannah introducing this romantic entanglement early on?
It's a brilliant way to heighten the stakes of the story.
Yeah.
We know, as Frankie knows, that love and loss often go hand in hand in war.
Right.
This isn't some idyllic romance. It's a powder keg of emotions set against a backdrop of constant danger. And that makes Jamie's eventual fate all the more heart-wrenching.
And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Oh, okay.
We'll see how Frankie copes with the loss of Jamie, the realities of working in a chaotic ER, and how those experiences begin to chip away at the young woman who stepped off the plane full of naive hope.
Yeah.
But we'll get into that after the break. We left off talking about Jamie's fate, and I have to say, knowing what's coming doesn't make it any easier to talk about.
Right.
His death hits Frankie, and honestly, it hit me as a reader.
Yeah.
Like a punch to the gut.
It's a loss that reverberates throughout the rest of the novel. And Hannah doesn't shy away from the, the raw, visceral grief that Frankie experiences. It's not just sadness.
Right.
It's anger, guilt, a sense of utter devastation.
And it's made even more complex by the fact that this loss mirrors what happened to Frankie before the war.
Right.
with her brother Finley's death.
Exactly.
Hannah subtly draws those parallels, showing how trauma can echo and amplify across different experiences in a person's life.
That layering of loss is so powerful. It reinforces that for many who serve, war isn't a contained experience.
Right.
It becomes interwoven with their personal histories, their understanding of life and death, their capacity for love and connection.
It makes you think about how we as readers, but also just as human beings, process stories of loss. We often focus on the immediacy of it, who died, how it happened. But Hannah forces us to sit with the ripple effects,
Yeah.
the long shadow that grief casts over Frankie's life.
And she does that while simultaneously thrusting Frankie and us as readers
Right.
into the heart of the ER,
Yes.
which becomes its own kind of battleground. Those scenes are chaotic, visceral, almost overwhelming in their descriptions of blood and suffering.
The way Hannah writes about the ER, it's almost like you're right there with Frankie. Feeling the stickiness of the heat, smelling the antiseptic and blood,
Oh, absolutely.
hearing the constant groans of pain.
Yeah.
It's a sensory overload that really brings home the relentless pressure these nurses were under.
Remember that detail about Frankie assisting with the debridement for the first time?
Oh, gosh.
It's a procedure most people would struggle to even read about, but Hannah doesn't flinch away from it.
It was tough to read, but it felt so real.
Yeah.
And it's moments like that where Frankie pushes past her own fear and inexperience. You really see her character solidify. She's not the same naive young woman who stepped off the plane anymore.
Absolutely. The ER becomes her crucible. And it's not just her medical skills that are tested.
Yeah.
It's her resilience, her compassion, her very sense of self.
Yeah.
And it's in this pressure cooker environment that her bonds with Barb and Ethel become even more crucial.
They go from being colleagues to something much deeper.
Right.
Almost like sisters bound together by shared trauma and the unspoken language of those who've witnessed too much.
That sense of camaraderie, of finding solace and strength in shared experience, is a powerful theme that Hannah explores throughout the novel. It's a lifeline for these women. A reminder that even in the darkest of places, human connection can be found.
And for Frankie, that connection extends beyond her fellow nurses. It's there in the letters that she exchanges with her family,
Right.
even if they don't fully understand what she's going through.
Yeah, and it's definitely present in the work she eventually finds.
Right.
With the League of POW MIA families after she returns home. That becomes another form of connection, a way for her to channel her own grief and trauma into something meaningful.
It's interesting, though, because even as Frankie finds ways to cope, the war doesn't magically release its grip on her. The transition back to life in California is anything but easy.
That's where Hannah masterfully shifts the focus from the external battles of the war to the internal battles that so many veterans face. Frankie returns to this idyllic setting, yet she's haunted by nightmares, struggling with what we now recognize as PTSD.
And what's heartbreaking is how her family, despite their best intentions, just doesn't get it.
Right.
They expect her to slot back into her old life as if nothing has changed, as if war hasn't irrevocably altered her worldview. Have you ever noticed how often we as a society expect that kind of seamless transition from those who've served?
It's a disconnect that Hannah captures perfectly, the chasm between those who've experienced war firsthand and those who haven't. And it speaks to the larger challenge of how we support veterans, how we bridge that gap in understanding so that they don't feel so alone in their struggles.
Frankie's story, even though it's fictional, shines a light on a very real and often overlooked aspect of wartime experience. It's not just about the battles fought overseas. It's about the battles that continue long after the soldiers return home.
And that's something I think anyone who's experienced trauma, regardless of whether it stems from war, can relate to. That sense of displacement, of feeling like you've returned to a world that no longer fits.
It makes you realize how important it is to talk about these experiences. To make space for those difficult conversations so that others don't feel so isolated in their pain.
Absolutely. And that's something we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll delve into Frankie's struggle to find her voice, to advocate for herself and other veterans, and to ultimately find a path towards healing.
You know, it's one thing to survive like the chaos of a war zone.
Right.
But finding your footing back home, that's a whole different battle.
Absolutely.
And Frankie's journey in this last part of the book, it really highlights that struggle.
It really does. And what's interesting is that Hannah doesn't shy away from the kind of messiness of healing.
Right.
You know, Frankie's PTSD manifests in these really specific ways. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the way that certain sounds or smells can transport her back to Vietnam.
Those details make it so visceral for the reader. I remember that scene where Frankie loses it at a 4th of July barbecue
Oh, yeah.
because the sound of firework sends her spiraling. It's a stark reminder that for many veterans, the war lives on inside them,
Right.
even when the world around them has moved on.
Exactly. And that's where that disconnect with her family becomes even more pronounced. They want to celebrate to pretend things are normal. But Frankie's reality is fractured. She's carrying this invisible weight that they can't see or understand.
It's like they want the old Frankie back, the carefree girl who left for Vietnam. But the war has fundamentally changed her, and she's still figuring out who she is in this new reality.
And part of that process involves her finding her voice. One of the most compelling aspects of the novel is watching Frankie go from being silenced by her trauma
Right.
to becoming an advocate for herself and other veterans.
That scene where she confronts her father about his hero's wall is incredible.
Yes, such a powerful moment.
It's like she's finally giving voice to all the unspoken anger, the frustration, the feeling of being utterly unseen by a society that claims to honor its veterans.
Right, it's like she's reclaiming her narrative in that moment.
Yes.
She's refusing to let her service be defined solely by her wounds or by society's expectations.
And it's not just about her individual experience. Through her work with the League of POW MIA families, Frankie finds a sense of purpose.
Right.
And helping other veterans and their families navigate the complexities of the system.
That's such an important point because it highlights how isolating the aftermath of war can be,
Yeah.
especially for those who feel, misunderstood or forgotten. By coming together, by sharing their stories and supporting one another, these characters find strength and solidarity.
And it's the unwavering support of her friends, particularly Barb, that helps Frankie navigate this difficult terrain.
Right.
Their bond, forged in the crucible of war, becomes this anchor for Frankie as she fights for recognition and healing.
Their friendship is a testament to the power of female connection, particularly in the face of adversity. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism happen not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments of support and understanding we offer one another.
That scene where they participate in the silent march in Washington, D.C., surrounded by thousands of other veterans, it's incredibly moving.
It's such a powerful image.
It speaks to the power of collective action, of finding your voice in a chorus of others who've shared similar experiences.
It's a powerful image that transcends the Vietnam War itself. It speaks to the importance of bearing witness, of standing up for what's right, and of demanding that those in power acknowledge the true cost of war.
But even as Frankie finds her voice as she starts to heal,
Yeah.
Hannah doesn't tie everything up with a neat bow.
Exactly, and that's what makes the ending so powerful and thought-provoking.
Right.
Frankie's story doesn't end with this triumphant return to normalcy. It ends with the understanding that healing is a journey, not a destination.
Her final conversation with Rye, where he reveals the depths of his own trauma, really underscores that point.
It does.
It's a quiet but profound moment that reminds us that the wounds of war, both visible and invisible, can linger long after the fighting has ceased. It made me wonder, what are our responsibilities to those who come home bearing those unseen scars?
It's a question that Hannah, I think, challenges us to grapple with.
Yeah.
How do we as a society create space for those difficult conversations, for acknowledging the complexities of trauma and healing?
And how do we ensure that the stories of those who have served, especially those often overlooked or forgotten, are heard and honored?
That's where the power of literature, of stories like The Women, comes into play.
Yes.
By stepping into Frankie's shoes, by experiencing the war and its aftermath through her eyes, we're forced to confront those questions, to expand our understanding of what it means to serve and to heal.
Frankie's journey is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But it's also a stark reminder that the battles fought on distant battlefields often continue long after the soldiers have returned home. It's a story that stays with you long after you finish the last page, prompting reflection on the true cost of war and the importance of compassion, understanding, and support for those who sacrifice so much.
Well said. I think that's a great place to leave it.
Thank you so much for taking a deep dive with us.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.